welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night. Tonight, I will be telling some true scary stories. I hope you enjoy your stay with us on this rainy night. Without further ado, let's begin. This happened to me about 11 years ago when walking home from a friend's house at night. I'll just get straight into it. I used to live in a rural part of the UK and have lived in rural areas most of my life, so I was used to long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never bothered me too much. I'd get creeped out occasionally, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I ever had. There was this one friend who used to live roughly 3 miles away from my house. He had cool parents and my other friends, and I would often go over his house and play video games and hang out. Occasionally, this meant walking home at night if I stayed late. There were 2 ways back from his house. The roadway, which was about 5 miles long and took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were very quiet and eerie sometimes, but they were lit by street lamps, so it never bothered me walking this way. The other way was a shortcut through some woods, which took off about 2 miles, and the wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored the wooded shortcut and have probably walked it over 100 times. The woods were dark, however, combined with a lack of ambient light due to living in a rural area, and you had absolute abyssal darkness. Luckily, most of the time I had my phone light to walk with, but sometimes my phone would die, or the battery would be so low. The flash wouldn't work, and I'd have to use my screen light. As you've probably guessed by now, this was one of those occasions. I remember my friends and I had just finished watching a film. It was nearing 10 p.m., so we all left my friend's house and headed our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly which way I should go and decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed into the woods. The street lights dimmed as I entered the fields before the woods. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was really low, only enough power left for a couple of minutes of flash, and then I'd have to use my screen for light. That wouldn't last the whole way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the flash and followed the well-trodden path into the dark. To my dismay, my light died within seconds of entering, and I flipped my phone over to try and shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for all of the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. Funky tree stump, check. Half-fallen fir tree, check. Enormous puddle I had to jump over. Check. Enormous puddle I had to jump over. All was going well. I was halfway through the woods when my phone completely died. I remember the moment it happened. I was engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've experienced this level of darkness before, but it was so dark I couldn't even see the outline of my hand centimeters in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed considerably, and I started holding my hand out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued walking for another minute or so, until all of a sudden a pungent smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. I glanced around but couldn't see anything. Then I heard it, a cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods in the dark? Are they following me? Am I lost? I quickened my pace again, throwing a little caution to the wind. I carried on walking and tripped slightly on a branch. As I regained my balance, I heard another sound. Branches breaking underfoot. What sounded like right behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps that grew louder and louder. I started sprinting. I felt the well-trodden path turn to brush. I felt branches, logs, and plants hitting my legs. It wasn't long before I fell hard. I was lying on the floor, holding my knee. I could still hear branches snapping around me and a voice muttering something. I didn't dare move. Then, all of a sudden, they turned on a torch. I couldn't see anything except for the beam of light, which seemed to be eaten quickly by the darkness of the forest. I lay motionless on the ground as the beam swept through the trees. I could still hear the person mumbling, a deep growl. The crunching of footfalls grew and grew. They were only several feet from me by this point. I couldn't breathe. The light went out, the snapping of branches grew, and then nothing. Quiet. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything. Then I could hear wheezing. Right. Above. Me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me, and I wouldn't know. This carried on for about 5 minutes until the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs started up again and got fainter and fainter as they moved away from me. I remained lying down for another 5 or 10 minutes, contemplating my escape. Like an idiot, I'd ran off the path and wasn't sure which way was back to it. Or was home. I didn't really care, I thought. I thought I was going to walk in one direction until I left the woods and get home from there. I knew as soon as I started moving again, if the person was still in the woods, they would hear me. Should I run or try and sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings, picked a direction and started walking. I wasn't perfectly quiet, but quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in the distance, and every time I froze, I'd hold my breath until I was happy no one was there and then start walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity until eventually I found the path. I screamed for joy in my mind and sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes, I saw it. Light. Street lights filtering in through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see a meager street lamp. But as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart sank. At the end of the path was a black silhouette. Unmoving. Contrasted against the light background was the dark figure of a man. What should I do? Maybe it's a different person. Perhaps it's someone walking their dog. I froze and watched them silently, but they didn't move at all. They just stood there like they were guarding the entrance to the woods. I didn't know what to do. By this point, I'd had enough. I was so close to getting out. I decided to just run straight towards the exit. Straight towards them. I was a 6'4" young man. If they wanted to stop me, they'd have a hard job of it, I thought. So that's what I did. I started sprinting. The figure grew and grew, and as I reached them, I stepped to the side. I heard someone growl "fuck" loudly and felt something clip the back of my head and tug the back of my jacket. I cleared the sheep gate in one leap and sprinted into the light. I eventually stopped running when I could see the first house and looked back. The entrance to the woods was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing by the entrance. Relaxing a bit more now, I finished my walk home. That's pretty much it. I know I could have overreacted. It could have been someone out for a walk in the woods, a dog walker, or camper. But what I thought was strange was that they didn't use their torch, except briefly on one occasion. Once they heard me, they also actively seeked me out. Who knows what would have happened if they caught me? In any case, I never walked that way home alone again. Not at night, anyway. Back in the 80s, my Aunt Kay was in her early 20s. She used to drive long distances back and forth between her parents and her boyfriend, my uncle. It was a long drive across several states through the desert, which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. A couple of hours into one of these drives, Aunt Kay noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to Les Miserables until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into her rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she said she felt and heard as clear as day. "Don't pull over." Then again, stronger. "Don't pull over." Then again, stronger. Don't pull over. Call it God, intuition, or just a gut feeling. But a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through Aunt Kay's body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself what the hell was that as she saw the vehicle peel out behind her. The dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flash their brights and motion to her to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning she felt? It would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, especially before cell phones. But she pressed on. Just as her resolve wavered, she started questioning if she truly did feel what she felt. She started slowing back down when the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane and came level to my aunt's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and mouthed the words, "Pull over," to my aunt. She said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach, and again heard the words in her head, "Don't pull over." She described him as looking scary, greasy, and noticed he was missing a couple of teeth in his smile that she'll never forget. That sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thought she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her. She slowed down. He slowed down. She sped up. He sped up. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was to the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her alone. Out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aunt Kay sees a couple of semis off in the distance. She felt if only she could get close or even get in between those trucks, she would be safe. So she took off. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn, and try to hit her car until she got close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down and eventually disappear from view. She stayed with the trucks for a couple of hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Fast forward several years. My Aunt Kay and uncle are married. He's working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. She's now a full-time mom of several young children. Since I've known my aunt, she's been obsessed with true crime. Dateline, 2020, and unsolved mysteries were always playing at their house. This day was no different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room. The interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As she paired another match of socks, she heard the man describe one of his tactics for procuring victims. According to him, he would wait along the side of the highway. A car would go by with a family, and he'd wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he'd wait. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty woman driving alone. So I'd pull out behind and follow him. I'd flash my brights, honk, and motion for him to pull over. Aunt Kay, paralyzed, continued to listen. When they would eventually pull over, I'd tell him to pop the hood and I'd be able to tell him what was wrong with their car. They would, and I'd yank a couple wires. When the car wouldn't start, I'd tell him no problems. My buddy has a shop in the next town. I can give you a ride and he'll give you a fair deal. My aunt slowly moved to the living room. They'd get in and I'd rape and kill them. Bury him anywhere in the desert. When asked how many times he did this, he responded, "They'll never find all the bodies. I can't even count." And how many got away? 2 or 3. My aunt stood alone staring into the same toothless grin she saw on that highway that day. It was Henry Lee Lucas. Growing up in the deep woods of southern Missouri, I was no stranger to tales of ghosts and monsters that supposedly roamed the forest. But I never took them too seriously. After all, I knew those woods like the back of my hand, having explored them since I was just 6 months old. However, a few years ago, something happened that made me question everything. It was a typical night in 2010. and I was walking along one of my usual trails when I suddenly felt like something wasn't right. It was as if I was walking 3 feet behind my own body. Then I heard the sound of a large oak branch snapping, hitting the ground with a hard thud. The woods went completely silent. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing yellow eyes staring right at me from the shadows. They were several yards away down the trail, but still seemed several feet off the ground. A low, thundering growl came from the same direction. It was like the growl of a tiger mixed with a bear. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen with fear. The creature turned around to go deeper into the woods, revealing itself in the moonlight. It was a black mountain lion with the head and body size of a grizzly bear. It looked like it hadn't eaten in a month, as if it was nothing more than skin and bones. I watched as it disappeared into the darkness. After that night, I never went into the woods without my survival knife. Even during the day, I felt like I was being watched. And on the quietest nights of the year, I could hear the creature outside my window, staring at me with those same glowing yellow eyes. I'm not the only one who's felt its presence either. Several friends who have come over for the day have gone home that night, telling me they felt like they were being watched from outside. Now, I know that the stories of monsters in the woods aren't just stories. They're real,